The story of the Lost Army of Cambyses originates from the account of the Greek historian Herodotus. Writing in the 5th century BCE, he describes a Persian force that vanished in the Egyptian desert. The implication is a documented disappearance, while the limitation is reliance on a single ancient source. According to Herodotus, King Cambyses II of Persia sent an army of approximately 50,000 soldiers toward the Siwa Oasis. This implies a large-scale military operation. The limitation is that Herodotus wrote decades after the events he described. The Persian Empire at the time controlled vast territories, making such expeditions plausible. This supports logistical feasibility. The limitation is that imperial capacity does not confirm the specific mission described. Herodotus states that the army disappeared after being caught in a massive sandstorm. This implies a natural cause. The limitation is that no physical evidence has confirmed such an event affecting a force of that size. The Siwa Oasis was a known religious center, home to the Oracle of Amun. This suggests a political or religious motive for the expedition. The limitation is uncertainty about Cambyses' intentions. Ancient sources outside Herodotus do not mention the lost army. This absence raises questions about corroboration. The limitation is that many Persian records have not survived. The desert between the Nile Valley and Siwa is harsh and difficult to navigate. This environment implies high risk for large troop movements. The limitation is that experienced armies often adapted to desert travel. Persian military logistics relied on supply lines and local support. This suggests planning. The limitation is that disruption of supplies could have catastrophic consequences. The scale of the reported army implies significant archaeological traces. This creates an investigative expectation. The limitation is that desert conditions can rapidly obscure evidence. Sandstorms in the Sahara are capable of burying objects quickly. This supports Herodotus' explanation. The limitation is that complete burial of an entire army remains unverified. Some scholars question the reported number of soldiers, suggesting exaggeration. This implies narrative inflation. The limitation is lack of alternative figures. Cambyses II is portrayed in ancient sources as volatile and impious. This characterization implies reckless decision-making. The limitation is potential bias in Greek portrayals of Persian rulers. The Persian invasion of Egypt is well documented. This confirms Cambyses' presence in the region. The limitation is connecting this campaign directly to the Lost Army narrative. The route from Thebes to Siwa would have required precise navigation. This implies local guides. The limitation is absence of records identifying such guides. Herodotus describes the army stopping at an oasis before vanishing. This implies a traceable path. The limitation is that the specific oasis is not clearly identified. No contemporary Egyptian sources describe the disappearance. This silence complicates verification. The limitation is loss of local records. Some historians argue the account may serve as a cautionary tale about hubris. This implies moral framing. The limitation is separating allegory from history. The lack of Persian inscriptions referencing the expedition raises doubts. This implies omission. The limitation is selective survival of records. Archaeological surveys in the Western Desert have been limited by terrain and scale. This restricts discovery. The limitation is incomplete exploration. The desert landscape changes over time due to wind and erosion. This implies potential loss of evidence. The limitation is unpredictability of preservation. Ancient military disasters were sometimes downplayed or omitted from official records. This implies intentional silence. The limitation is speculative inference. Herodotus' work blends inquiry with storytelling. This complicates interpretation. The limitation is assessing historical accuracy. Despite doubts, the account persisted across centuries. This implies enduring credibility. The limitation is repetition does not equal verification. The Lost Army narrative has influenced modern exploration efforts. This implies continued interest. The limitation is that exploration has not produced confirmation. Modern scholars debate whether the army truly vanished or was defeated by human forces. This introduces alternative explanations. The limitation is lack of evidence for conflict. The desert contains ancient caravan routes. This suggests possible misdirection rather than disappearance. The limitation is absence of material traces. Climate studies show desert conditions could have been severe during the period. This supports environmental hazard. The limitation is correlating climate data with a single event. The story's simplicity contrasts with complex military realities. This raises skepticism. The limitation is narrative compression. No mass graves or weapon caches have been definitively linked to the Lost Army. This absence sustains mystery. The limitation is incomplete coverage. At this contextual stage, the Lost Army of Cambyses remains defined by a single ancient account, plausible environmental danger, and missing evidence. The implication is unresolved disappearance, while the limitation is clear. Confirmation remains elusive. Modern investigations into the Lost Army of Cambyses attempt to reconcile Herodotus' account with geography and environmental science. This implies interdisciplinary analysis. The limitation is that modern methods still rely on an ancient narrative as the starting point. Satellite imagery has been used to identify potential ancient routes across the western desert. This suggests possible paths taken by the army. The limitation is that route identification does not confirm presence of troops. Some researchers propose that the army followed established caravan tracks towards Siwa. This implies logistical planning. The limitation is that such routes shifted over time and left minimal durable traces. Geological studies confirm that powerful sandstorms can drastically alter desert landscapes. This supports the plausibility of sudden burial. The limitation is that no verified case demonstrates complete erasure of a force of this size. Alternative theories suggest the army was ambushed by local forces or rival groups. This implies human conflict rather than natural disaster. The limitation is absence of weapons, fortifications, or battle remains. The western desert contained nomadic groups capable of resisting intrusion. This suggests potential opposition. The limitation is lack of historical records describing such an engagement. Some scholars argue the army may have become disoriented and fragmented rather than destroyed at once. This implies gradual loss. The limitation is that fragmentation would likely leave dispersed evidence. Ancient military failures were sometimes transformed into moral narratives. This implies Herodotus' account may carry symbolic weight. The limitation is determining the balance between symbolism and reporting. Excavations in suspected regions have uncovered isolated artifacts from various periods. This suggests long-term human presence. The limitation is none can be conclusively linked to Persian soldiers. The Persian military used standardized equipment and materials. This implies identifiable artifacts should exist. The limitation is that metal and organic materials degrade differently in desert conditions. Some expeditions claim to have found remains of weapons or bones. This implies possible discovery. The limitation is that none have been independently verified or dated to the Persian period. The vast search area complicates systematic excavation. This implies logistical constraints. The limitation is that incomplete surveys leave large gaps. Political instability and modern borders restrict access to some regions. This limits fieldwork. The limitation is reduced investigation capacity. Critics argue Herodotus may have relied on secondhand stories. This implies hearsay. The limitation is that his work often blends verified observation with reported accounts. Persian royal inscriptions typically celebrated victories, not defeats. This implies omission of failures. The limitation is that silence does not confirm the event. Some historians suggest the army never existed as described. This implies narrative invention. The limitation is lack of evidence either way. Climate reconstructions indicate shifting desert margins over millennia. This suggests possible burial under dunes. The limitation is difficulty locating ancient surfaces. The story's endurance has fueled repeated expeditions. This implies persistent belief. The limitation is absence of tangible results. Archaeological methodology favors sites with clear contextual indicators. The Lost Army lacks such markers. The limitation is methodological exclusion. The desert's capacity to preserve or destroy evidence is inconsistent. This implies uneven survival. The limitation is unpredictability. Some modern analyses reinterpret the event as a smaller detachment rather than a full army. This reduces expected evidence. The limitation is speculative revision. Mapping ancient water sources suggests survival may have been possible longer than assumed. This challenges sudden annihilation. The limitation is that survival does not explain disappearance. The lack of burial practices evidence complicates casualty explanations. This implies abrupt loss. The limitation is incomplete understanding of Persian desert warfare. Technological advances continue to refine desert surveying. This suggests future potential. The limitation is diminishing probability over time. Academic consensus remains divided on literal versus symbolic interpretation. This reflects evidentiary ambiguity. The limitation is unresolved debate. The case highlights reliance on narrative in absence of artifacts. This defines its status. The limitation is evidentiary imbalance. The Lost Army of Cambyses remains a boundary case between history and legend. This complicates classification. The limitation is categorical uncertainty. No definitive discovery has altered understanding in recent decades. This suggests stagnation. The limitation is dependence on chance finds. The mystery persists because plausible explanations lack confirmation. This sustains inquiry. The limitation is unresolved verification. At this investigative stage, the disappearance of Cambyses' army remains unexplained by material evidence. The implication is enduring uncertainty, while the limitation remains unchanged. Without artifacts, conclusions cannot be secured. The continued absence of physical evidence has shaped modern interpretation of the Lost Army. Scholars increasingly focus on methodological limits rather than definitive answers. The implication is a shift in inquiry, while the limitation is that reframing does not resolve the original disappearance. Comparisons with other ancient military losses show that most leave archaeological traces. This contrast heightens the anomaly. The limitation is that desert environments behave differently from other landscapes. The scale of the alleged force remains central to skepticism. A large army should leave significant material remains. The limitation is that the reported number may be inaccurate. If the army fragmented, survivors might have integrated into local populations. This implies assimilation rather than annihilation. The limitation is lack of cultural or genetic evidence supporting this outcome. The narrative persists partly because it resists closure. This sustains historical interest. The limitation is that unresolved stories can drift toward speculation. Modern explorers often approach the story with expectations shaped by Herodotus. This influences search strategies. The limitation is confirmation bias. Advances in remote sensing may yet reveal buried evidence. This suggests future possibility. The limitation is that technological promise does not guarantee discovery. The Lost Army illustrates how single-source accounts shape historical memory. This highlights vulnerability in historiography. The limitation is dependence on limited testimony. The case underscores the importance of corroboration in ancient history. Without it, certainty remains elusive. The limitation is that corroboration may no longer be possible. Some historians treat the account as a warning against overconfidence in imperial power. This implies moral framing. The limitation is separating lesson from fact. The disappearance has become emblematic of nature's dominance over human ambition. This interpretation persists culturally. The limitation is symbolic emphasis. Archaeology accepts that some events leave no recoverable trace. This acknowledges limits. The limitation is acceptance without resolution. The desert's silence reinforces uncertainty. Evidence may exist beyond reach. The limitation is physical inaccessibility. Each failed search narrows expectations, but does not eliminate possibility. This sustains inquiry. The limitation is diminishing likelihood. The Lost Army challenges assumptions about historical completeness. Not all events are recoverable. The limitation is epistemological. Herodotus' credibility remains debated across his work. This affects interpretation. The limitation is evaluating accuracy without comparison. The story continues to be cited in discussions of ancient exploration and risk. This extends relevance. The limitation is reliance on unresolved cases. The disappearance reflects broader patterns of loss in ancient records. This contextualizes the mystery. The limitation is cumulative absence. The army's fate remains unknown despite centuries of inquiry. This defines the case. The limitation is absence of closure. Modern scholarship prioritizes probability over certainty. In this case, probability remains unclear. The limitation is ambiguous weighting of evidence. The Lost Army stands as a reminder of history's gaps. Some questions persist indefinitely. The limitation is acceptance of uncertainty. Without new material discoveries, interpretations will remain provisional. This constrains future work. The limitation is dependence on chance. The case highlights how environment, narrative, and power intersect in historical memory. This broadens understanding. The limitation is generalization. The disappearance has influenced both academic and popular imagination. This sustains attention. The limitation is divergence between interest and evidence. Scholars agree that the event cannot currently be confirmed or dismissed. This consensus reflects restraint. The limitation is unresolved status. The Lost Army of Cambyses remains suspended between explanation and doubt. This defines its place in history. The limitation is evidentiary silence. The mystery endures because available data supports multiple interpretations. None can be proven. The limitation is interpretive balance. History sometimes preserves events through absence rather than record. This case exemplifies that principle. The limitation is permanent uncertainty. The disappearance continues to be studied not for answers, but for what it reveals about historical limits. This reframes significance. The limitation is unresolved outcome. The facts are real. The explanation is up to you.